Hi, and welcome to this episode of John's Motorcycle Rescue and Review. Alright guys, I am super pumped. Today is the third installment in the Kawasaki ZG1000 Concours or GTR1000 Rescue project. In this project update video, I'll go over all of the progress that has been made since the previous project update video a couple weeks ago. The awesome news is that I was able to get the Concours to a point where it is roadworthy, and so in a little bit we'll take that out on the road and see what it's like to ride. We'll do a shakedown run, so you definitely want to stay tuned for that. At the end of the last video, we were waiting for parts, specifically the front brake caliper rebuild kits. Thankfully, this week those have come in, and yesterday I spent the day installing those. In the previous video, we also touched on cleaning the carburetors, and I have gone through those, and they are completely cleaned. I replaced all of the float needles in the carbs, and this past week I was able to bench test those. I actually bench tested them 3 times because the first 2 times that I bench tested them, I still had fuel leaking out of one of the carburetors. What that means is that one of the float valves is leaking and not shutting the fuel off. I pulled the float bowls off of the carbs that were leaking, and I ended up polishing the needle valve seats in the carbs. Normally I would have just replaced those, but it did not seem like the ones in the Concours were replaceable. I may be wrong on that. Regardless, I polished those out. I used a Q-tip with some very fine steel wool wrapped around the tip of that, and I chucked that up in my drill, and at low speed I put just a little bit of pressure on that, and I polished out the seats inside the carbs. Thankfully, that solution worked, and the carbs no longer leak. I was also able to reinstall them on the bike, and all I can say is grab your heat gun and make sure that you soften the boots as much as possible, specifically the boots that go from the carburetors to the airbox. Those are the ones that are really going to get deformed, and they're the ones that have to give quite a bit to get the carbs in and out of the bike. While I was doing that job and reassembling everything, I noticed that the throttle pull cable was already maxed out on its adjustment, and it was on the loose side, so I have ordered a new throttle pull cable. Before putting the carburetors back on the bike, I did install an inline fuel filter. I use an automotive style fuel filter. Those are higher quality than the clear plastic ones, and they block a lot more junk. They also flow a lot more fuel. Once you've spent the time cleaning the carbs, the last thing you want to do is hook the carbs back up and reintroduce any particulate or junk into your carburetors. It's not a job you want to do multiple times. While I was waiting for parts, I serviced my clutch lever. I pulled the lever off. I cleaned all of the pivot points. I re-greased the pivot points and reassembled everything. I also did the same thing on the brake side, on the front brake master cylinder, cleaning the pivots, re-lubricating those, and that way there's no stiction when I pull the clutch or when I pull the brake, and everything functions smoothly. While the fuel tank was off the bike, I decided to pull and inspect the petcock. I also looked around the inside of the gas tank at that lower portion. Thankfully, everything looked really good here. I have a suspicion that the previous owner had cleaned out the gas in the gas tank. Everything in there looked great. The petcock also functions like it should. When you turn it in the on or reserve position, it is off and there is no fuel coming out at all. And then when you turn it on to the prime position, the PRI position, the fuel flows out of the petcock freely. I reconnected the petcock. I also let the fuel tank sit for several days over a surface where I could observe if it was leaking or not. Thankfully, there were no leaks, no drips. Everything looks great on the fuel tank and the petcock. Another maintenance item that I tackled while I was waiting for parts was to clean and re-lubricate the steering stem bearings. I pulled those out of the bike. I cleaned the races in the steering stem. I also repacked and re-lubricated the steering stem bearings themselves, and then reassembled everything and torqued it down, and that should be ready to go. I was also able to complete the oil change. I got the parts I needed. I got the washer and the spring that I needed for the oil filter housing. I was able to mount those. I used 1040 motorcycle specific oil, and I filled it to level. And at that point, it was time to start the bike up. Let's see how she sounds. All right, guys, it is time for the moment of truth. The carbs are cleaned. The new air filter is in, the air box is back in, I've cleaned that as well, and the oil change is complete. And so I am ready to give this bike a try and start it up. Turning the fuel on. And because I don't have the tank on, I'm going to hold my hand over the vacuum line here. So that's awesome. The bike sounds good. I don't hear any bad noises from the motor. I will probably go in and check my valve clearances now that I've gotten it running and everything runs like it should. And we'll continue on with this project. Also, before getting out on the road, I checked to make sure that the transmission went up and down through all the gears. Those function as they should while the bike was stationary, so that was a good sign. I also made sure that I could push the bike while the bike was in gear and I had the clutch pulled in. That just means that the clutch pack is not stuck together. After making sure that the bike started up and was idling and running as it should engine-wise, I had a couple more checks to perform before getting out on the road. The first of which was to check and make sure that once the bike was up to temperature, that the cooling fan kicked on and worked properly. I had previously checked my coolant levels in the bike, both at the radiator and down underneath at the reservoir. Those levels look good. The next system I checked while I had the bike running and warm was the electrical system. After the bike was up to temperature, I checked the running voltage and it was well within spec of where it should be as well. So that means my charging system is functioning as it should. All right, enough talk. It is time to see how this Concours rides out on the road. I'm going to gear up. I'll bring the camera along. Let's find out together. Let's ride.
I am currently test driving my 1994 Kawasaki Concours ZG1000, and this is not my first shakedown run on this motorcycle. I usually don't film those because I want to be very focused on what the bike is doing, especially if I've done quite a bit of work to it. But I have put about 60 miles on this bike so far, and I am happy to report that the bike is running great. Not only does the engine sound nice and healthy, it pulls very nicely. It also shifts up through the gears very precisely, very nicely. The clutch functions as it should. And I'm happy to report that this bike is seeming to be very healthy, which is a great thing. Two things I'm noticing, the first of which is I may have my steering stem bearings just a little bit on the tight side. It kind of feels like that in the steering. Kind of feels like it's not quite doing exactly what I want it to do. I'm very sensitive to stuff like that, so I'll go and make sure those are adjusted properly. And the other thing I noticed while I was working on the bike was that the rear tire is a cruiser style bias ply tire, and the front tire is the proper radial sport touring tire. And so I'm going to swap out the back tire with a tire that is actually designed for this type of bike. But the bike is running smoothly. I don't notice a lot of vibration. I have not put the full fairing back on, so I will do that once I'm sure that there are no leaks or drips and that the bike is running 100% like it should. I'll go ahead and put everything back on it. But until then, I'll just run it with the top fairing in place. Very nice. Since rebuilding the brakes on this bike, they function as they should. There's no warpage in the rotors, which is excellent. And it's really nice to do all of the work that I've done and then get out and actually be able to enjoy the bike. And I'm really pleasantly surprised at how well this bike functions for a bike that's this old and for a bike that has 70-some thousand miles on it.
All right, I couldn't be happier with that. This bike runs like it should, it shifts like it should, it goes down the road very nicely. I've really thoroughly gone over every system on this bike and made sure that it was up to spec and functioning as it should and that it has new fluid in it. I've already put over 60 miles on the bike without any kind of concerns, and so I'm very, very happy with that. I am ordering a new rear tire for the bike. I will get the proper radial tire that matches the front tire, and we'll have a nice set of sport touring tires that are appropriate for the bike. Another next step on this motorcycle is to do a final check of the valve clearances and make sure that those are within spec. The engine doesn't make any bad noises, but that's always a good thing to check for peace of mind. Depending on how the spark plugs look, I may replace those while I'm in there. And as I said earlier, I am waiting on a new throttle pull cable, and that will allow me to set the throttle tension back to the factory settings. All right, guys, I'd love to know what you think. If any of you out there are Concours 1000 fans or GTR 1000 fans, please let me know in the comment section below. As always, I hope you found this video entertaining and informative, and until next time, enjoy the ride.